Former Trump. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows reportedly offering damning testimony against the former president to Special Counsel Jack Smith in exchange for immunity. That's according to ABC News. Our chief legal affairs correspondent Paula Reed is gathering details for us. Paula, what can you tell us?
Well, Wolf, CNN previously reported that Mark Meadows had testified before a federal grand jury investigating former President Trump. Now we're learning more about what he has reportedly told investigators. Now, according to reports, he's spoken with investigators 3 times over the past year, and he's told them that in the weeks following the 2020 election, he says that he told Trump that these allegations of significant voter fraud were baseless. Now, that is such a significant break from the rhetoric of former President Trump. It's also a significant break from what Meadows has said publicly, including in a book that he wrote because he said he wanted to, quote, set the record straight. He reportedly told investigators that Trump was being, quote, dishonest and that obviously we didn't win.
Hey people, Adam is here, so what just happened, guys? Mark Meadows flipped. The chief of staff, the gatekeeper, the man in the corner of every photograph, on every call, reading every classified memo that crossed the Resolute desk, has been granted immunity by Jack Smith and has sat down for multiple sworn interviews with federal prosecutors. He didn't slip away quietly. He walked prosecutors through the specific granular details of efforts to overturn a free and fair election. No one in that West Wing knew more, and now prosecutors know everything he knew.
Mark Meadows was given immunity in exchange for grand jury testimony earlier this year, right as Special Counsel Jack Smith was building his case against Donald Trump.
White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows was at the center of power by former President Trump's side in the hectic final weeks of his presidency.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
But when Trump claimed victory in the early hours after the election, sources say Meadows told federal prosecutors Trump was being dishonest because the final results were not in. Sources now telling ABC News Meadows secured immunity from Special Counsel Jack Smith to testify before the grand jury on a promise what Meadows said will not be used against him. The sources say Meadows also disavowed some of what he wrote in his book, that the election was stolen and rigged, and there was actual evidence of fraud right there in plain sight. The sources say Meadows told the special counsel he saw no evidence of fraud that would have changed the outcome.
The reporting on this is ironclad. It comes from the newsroom of ABC News, a legacy outlet that does not throw around the word immunity like confetti. This is verified information. This is a documented reality. We are talking about a man who was given a golden ticket, a waiver of his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, in exchange for the unvarnished, unfiltered, and utterly damning truth about what happened inside the White House during the most precarious transfer of power in modern memory.
This is a major development, Kana. The world had been watching this case for what Mark Meadows would do. Mark Meadows was Donald Trump's chief of staff. He was at his side throughout that entire post-election period where Trump was trying to overturn the presidential election, one of his most loyal and important aides. And what we're learning is that he has told federal prosecutors that the election was not stolen in his view. In fact, he said to those prosecutors, we are told, according to our sources, that he agreed with the assessment that the 2020 election was the most secure election in American history. And he told prosecutors, according to our sources, that he repeatedly told Donald Trump that the claims of widespread election fraud that they were hearing that were coming in were not turning out to be true.
And let me be perfectly clear about what this means from a prosecutorial standpoint. When the chief of staff, the person whose job is to execute the president's agenda and protect the president's interests, is sitting across the table from a special counsel under a grant of immunity, the evidentiary foundation of the entire defense structure begins to crack and crumble. This is the equivalent of the corporate CFO walking into the SEC and handing over the cooked books along with the keys to the vault. We are going to dissect every single component of this story today. We will examine the staggering volume of evidence that Meadows has already produced. We will unpack the specific legal mechanics of his immunity deal, and we will explain why the specific structure of the Georgia RICO case, combined with a recent judicial ruling against Meadows himself, paints a picture of legal jeopardy that is more acute and more imminent than almost anything else in the sprawling accountability landscape. So strap in, because we are taking a deep dive into the documented evidence that is making the political world tremble. Let us begin with the sheer, overwhelming volume of the paper trail. Because before we even get to the secret conversations with Jack Smith's team, we have to understand that the public record is already saturated with the fingerprints of Mark Meadows. The House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack received a treasure trove of more than 2,000 text messages from Meadows' own devices. 2,000. That is not a typo. That is a torrent of real-time, contemporaneous communication that captures the raw, unvarnished thinking of the highest levels of the executive branch during a live constitutional crisis. These are not recollections from a memoir written years later with the benefit of hindsight and a team of lawyers. These are the actual digital smoke signals sent in the heat of the moment. These texts reveal three distinct and legally lethal categories of knowledge. First, they reveal advanced knowledge of the security posture. In a message that has been scrutinized by legal experts across the political spectrum, Meadows communicates about the status of the National Guard and the planning for having assets on standby for January 6th. Why does this matter so much? Because it obliterates any potential defense rooted in the claim that the White House was caught off guard or surprised by the violence. The Chief of Staff was not surprised. He was texting about the operational security environment before the first window was broken or the first officer was assaulted. This demonstrates a pre-existing awareness of the volatile tinderbox that was being assembled on the National Mall. Second, the texts reveal active coordination with the organizers of the rally that preceded the attack. There is a direct, documented, digital tether between the West Wing and the individuals who were orchestrating the gathering of the crowd. This is not a matter of the president simply speaking at an event. This is evidence of the Chief of Staff engaging in the logistical and political choreography of the event that would serve as the launching pad for the insurrection. It connects the official apparatus of the White House directly to the unofficial and ultimately violent movement outside. And third, and perhaps most damning of all in the court of public opinion and the court of law, the texts capture the moment of sheer panic inside the White House as the Capitol was breached. In a frantic exchange, Meadows received urgent pleas, and himself participated in the transmission of those pleas, urging the President of the United States to call off the rioters. The text messages show that the people closest to Trump, his own family, and his own chief of staff, understood the gravity of the moment and begged for intervention. And what did the commander-in-chief do in response to those documented, desperate pleas? The public record and the video timeline show a yawning, deafening silence and delay. These texts are the living, breathing documentation of a dereliction of duty. They are the closest thing we have to a digital transcript of a crime scene. Now, if the 2,000 texts were the only thing in the arsenal, this would already be a significant problem. But the texts are merely the opening act. The main event is the immunity deal and the subsequent interviews with the Special Counsel. We must spend a significant amount of time on the legal mechanics of this, because the public often misunderstands what a grant of immunity actually signifies in a complex criminal investigation. Immunity is not a get-out-of-jail-free card given out of the kindness of a prosecutor's heart. Immunity is a scalpel. It is a tool used to extract the core of a conspiracy from someone who would otherwise be a target or a co-conspirator. When Special Counsel Jack Smith granted immunity to Mark Meadows, he was not saying, "We think you're innocent." He was saying, "We think the information locked inside your head is so valuable to the prosecution of others, specifically the principal target, that we are willing to give you a pass to get it." This is a seismic event because of Meadows' specific position. He was the chief of staff. This is not a low-level aide who saw a snippet of a calendar invite. This is not a peripheral advisor who was in the room for 5 minutes. This is the man whose entire job description was to know everything the president knew. He was the central nervous system of the Trump White House. He managed the schedule, he managed the staff, and he managed the flow of information. And now, under the compulsion of an immunity order, meaning if he lies, he goes to prison for perjury, he is walking Jack Smith's team through the decision-making tree of those final, frantic weeks. He is telling them what was said in the private Oval Office meetings when the lawyers were gone. He is telling them what the president's true intentions were regarding the pressure campaign on Vice President Mike Pence. He is filling in the gaps between the text messages. The texts tell us what was typed. The immunity testimony tells us why it was typed and what was said that was too sensitive to put in writing. This is the difference between having a map of the battlefield and having the general who drew the map sitting next to you explaining where all the landmines are buried. And when we talk about the pressure campaign on Vice President Pence, we are talking about the absolute center of the bullseye for the federal case. The entire scheme to subvert the Electoral College certification hinged on getting Mike Pence to break the law and the Constitution. The documentary evidence already shows Meadows was a central hub for this pressure. His communications reveal the coordination with outside lawyers pushing fringe legal theories and the internal White House strategy to corner Pence. But now, with immunity, prosecutors aren't just reading the emails. They are asking Meadows, what did the president say to Pence on that phone call? What was the tone? Was this a suggestion or a directive? Was there an awareness that what was being asked was illegal? These are the questions that can only be answered by someone who was in the room, and Mark Meadows was the only person standing between the door and the president for most of those encounters. His testimony transforms the pressure campaign from a political dispute into a documented criminal conspiracy. We must also pivot our attention to the state of Georgia, because the legal developments down in Fulton County add a layer of complexity and danger that is often overlooked in the national conversation. Mark Meadows attempted a legal Hail Mary. He tried to move his state criminal charges to federal court. He argued, through his attorneys, that everything he did, the infamous phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State, the coordination with local officials, was all part of his official duties as a federal officer. He wanted the case heard in a venue he perceived as more favorable, under federal law rather than state RICO statutes. And a federal judge, after reviewing the evidence and the law, slammed the door shut. The judge rejected Meadows' removal attempt. This was not a minor procedural defeat. This was a devastating preview of the legal road ahead. The judge essentially ruled that the conduct Meadows was engaged in, specifically trying to interfere with the administration of a state election, falls well outside the bounds of a federal employee's official duties. You cannot claim federal immunity for a state election heist. Why is this ruling such a bad omen for everyone else in the Georgia case? Because the legal theory Meadows used to try and escape to federal court is the exact same legal theory that Donald Trump and his other co-defendants will likely attempt to use. The judge has already shown his cards. He has already looked at the same arguments applied to the chief of staff and said, "No, this does not fly. This is not federal business. This is a state matter, and you will face the music in a state courthouse." It is a flashing red warning sign that the effort to use the shield of the federal government to deflect state-level accountability is likely doomed. The Fulton County case, with its racketeering charges that treat the entire effort as a criminal enterprise, is not going anywhere. It is anchored in state law, and Mark Meadows' failure to move it is a testament to that anchor's strength. Now let's step back and examine the broader mosaic of what is happening here through a few critical lenses that tie all of this documented evidence together. There is the lens of the evidentiary landscape, the lens of the inner circle flip, and the lens of the RICO framework. Understanding how these three elements interact is essential to understanding why the panic is real. The evidentiary landscape is now a two-headed monster. On one side, you have the public, visible, and unspinnable text messages that have already been aired in congressional hearings and read by millions of Americans. They establish the timeline, the awareness, and the inaction. On the other side, you have the secret, sworn, and protected testimony being given to a grand jury or in proffer sessions to Jack Smith's team. This is the hidden iceberg beneath the waterline. The public texts are the wake-up call. The private testimony is the collision that sinks the ship. Meadows is uniquely positioned to stitch these two worlds together. He can explain the context of a text message that, standing alone, might be innocuous, but when paired with his testimony becomes an overt act in furtherance of a conspiracy. He is the Rosetta Stone for the entire 2020 election interference investigation. The significance of the inner circle flip cannot be overstated. If you have ever watched a mob movie or a true crime documentary, you know that the most dangerous person to the boss is the consigliere. It is the person who knows where the bodies are buried because they helped dig the graves. Mark Meadows is that consigliere. He was present for the most sensitive conversations. He was on the phone calls with state officials. He was in the meetings with the Department of Justice. He was the filter through which all bad news and all risky ideas had to pass. When a prosecutor secures the cooperation of the inner circle member, the entire conspiracy is illuminated from the inside out. It is no longer a matter of inferring intent from outside behavior. The prosecutor now has a guide who can testify directly to the state of mind of the participants. Meadows can answer the most critical question of all. What did Donald Trump know, and when did he know it? And equally important, what did Donald Trump believe? Did he genuinely believe the election was stolen, or was the stolen election narrative a pretext, a knowing lie deployed to justify a power grab? The Chief of Staff is the one witness who can credibly speak to the president's private admissions and private doubts. Then there is the power of the Georgia RICO framework. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, is a legal sledgehammer. It was designed to take down the mafia by proving that a group of individuals operated as a criminal enterprise. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis has charged this case as a RICO conspiracy. What this means in practical terms is that the prosecution does not have to prove that Mark Meadows personally committed a specific act of violence or fraud. They only have to prove that he was a member of an enterprise that engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity aimed at stealing the election. His texts and his testimony are not just about him. They are about the entire web of lawyers, state officials, and political operatives. His cooperation is like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples of that cooperation extend outward and touch every single co-defendant in the indictment. It allows the prosecution to present a sweeping, cohesive narrative of a coordinated scheme rather than a disjointed series of isolated, unfortunate phone calls. As we look at the specific content of the evidence that has already leaked out or been officially released, the detail that continues to haunt this entire story is the specific awareness of the potential for danger. The National Guard standby text is the piece of evidence that legal scholars and former prosecutors return to again and again. It is the smoking gun of mens rea, the guilty mind. It proves that the highest levels of the White House staff did not view January 6th as just another day of peaceful protest. They were actively discussing the deployment of armed soldiers to the streets of the capital city. They were gaming out the security scenarios. They knew the crowd was large, they knew the crowd was angry, and they knew the crowd was being directed toward the Capitol. In the face of that specific, documented knowledge, the subsequent inaction during the attack becomes not just a political failure, but a piece of evidence of intent. It is the difference between a negligent accident and a willful allowance of a foreseeable outcome. The Meadows texts ensure that the foreseeability of the violence is no longer a matter of debate. It is a matter of record. And what about the urgency? The texts begging for Trump to call off the rioters? These messages come from the innermost circle, his own children, his own communications staff, and his own chief of staff. They are pleading with the one person on the planet who had the megaphone and the authority to stop the bleeding. The evidence shows that Mark Meadows, the man who ran the White House, understood that the only way to end the siege was for the president to tell his supporters to go home. And yet, for a period of time that felt like an eternity to those trapped inside the Capitol and those defending it, the call did not come. Meadows' testimony about those hours, the atmosphere in the West Wing, the conversations he had with Trump, the reasons given for the delay, will be the centerpiece of any obstruction of an official proceeding charge. He was the messenger who was ignored, And now, under immunity, he is the messenger delivering that truth to a federal grand jury. The response from the Trump camp to this avalanche of evidence has been predictable in its form, but striking in its weakness. They call Meadows a disgruntled former employee. They call him a liar. They suggest that the text messages are taken out of context. But you cannot take a text message about having the National Guard on standby out of context. That is a statement of operational reality. You cannot take a text message from someone begging to stop the violence out of context. That is a plea for help in the middle of a catastrophe. The attempts to discredit Meadows are a classic deflection play, but they crash against the rocks of the sheer volume and specificity of the documentary record. When you have 2,000 texts and a grant of immunity from a skeptical special counsel, the disgruntled employee narrative sounds less like a defense and more like the squealing of tires as a getaway car tries to find traction on ice. As we move toward the conclusion of this deep dive, we need to position ourselves to watch the future unfold with clear eyes. The story of Mark Meadows is far from over. It is just entering its most consequential phase. There are specific indicators and events on the horizon that will tell us whether this evidence is having the devastating impact that the legal mechanics suggest it should. First, watch the pretrial motions in both the federal case in Washington, D.C. and the state case in Fulton County, Georgia. Pay close attention to any references to Witness A or unnamed co-conspirators. The details of Meadows' testimony will likely be hotly contested and heavily redacted, but the shape of his cooperation will become visible in the arguments prosecutors make about the admissibility of certain evidence. If Jack Smith's team starts making arguments that rely heavily on insider knowledge of Trump's state of mind, you can bet the farm that Mark Meadows is the source of that knowledge. Second, watch for any new indictments or superseding indictments. The Meadows testimony may have opened doors to other witnesses or filled in gaps regarding other individuals who have not yet been charged. A cooperative chief of staff can name names and confirm roles that were previously only suspected. The ripples from his cooperation could result in additional legal exposure for people who thought they had escaped the notice of investigators. Third, watch the trial schedule in Georgia. The Fulton County case is massive, with numerous defendants. How the judge handles the timeline and whether any other defendants seek to follow Meadows' lead in seeking a plea deal or cooperation agreement will be a direct result of the pressure created by his central testimony. When the person at the top of the food chain starts talking, the people lower down on the ladder start to worry that they will be left holding the bag. We may see a cascade effect of cooperation that further isolates the principal target. And finally, watch the political response in the context of the upcoming election cycle. The American people will be asked to render a verdict before a jury ever does. The fact that the chief of staff, the man who was supposed to be the ultimate loyalist, has turned state's evidence is a narrative that breaks through the partisan noise. It is a simple, devastating fact. The person who knew the president best thought the evidence was so damning and his own exposure so great that he took an immunity deal to save himself. You cannot spin that away on a podcast or a social media post. That is a headline that writes itself and cuts to the bone of the witch hunt defense. Here is the absolute, unvarnished truth that you must carry with you from this video. The documented reality of Mark Meadows' cooperation is a paradigm shift. We have more than 2,000 contemporaneous text messages that place him at the center of the storm, showing advanced knowledge of the National Guard situation, coordination with rally organizers, and real-time desperate pleas for the president to stop the violence. We have confirmed reporting from ABC News that this man, facing his own legal peril, has been granted immunity and has provided multiple interviews to Special Counsel Jack Smith about the specific efforts to overturn the 2020 election. We have a federal judge in Georgia who has already rejected his attempt to claim his actions were official duties, signaling that the state RICO case will proceed with full force. This is not a matter of guessing or hoping. This is a matter of documented, verified, and legally actionable fact. The chief of staff flipped. He is cooperating. He is providing the insider roadmap to the most consequential investigation of a former president in American history. The combination of the public documentary evidence with the private sworn testimony from the man who stood closest to the flames creates a legal inferno that no amount of political rhetoric can extinguish. No honest observer can predict with certainty that an arrest is guaranteed on a specific date, because the wheels of justice grind slowly and deliberately. But the conditions on the ground have changed. The landscape is different. The man who knew everything is now telling everything. And in the long, sordid history of political and legal scandals, that is the one development that almost always